Good evening, wanderer. Find a quiet place, rest your weary head, and let the dark whispers of Tasmania's past cradle you into stillness. Tonight, we travel deep into the shadows of a place carved into the cliffs and echoing through the forests, a place where pain, punishment, and whispers of the supernatural have lingered for generations. This is Port Arthur, once a brutal penal colony, now a place of eerie beauty and unsettling calm. But among its ruins and misty pathways, one legend casts the darkest shadow of all, the Witch of Port Arthur. She is said to have cursed men, defied death, and haunted stone and soul alike. Some say she was wronged. Others say she was evil itself. Before we step into the past, take a moment to breathe in and let go. You're safe now. Let the story do the walking. And if you enjoy wandering through haunted tales, where truth clings to myth like moss on sandstone, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel before sleep takes you and the dreams begin. Now, let's go back, way back, to where it all began, the shadow over Port Arthur. The sea mist rolled in like a living thing, curling around the jagged stones and rusted iron of what remained of Port Arthur. To most who visited, it was simply a historical site, a preserved skeleton of Australia's penal past. But to those who stayed a little longer, who wandered the ruins after dusk, or listened closely to the wind among the eucalyptus, there was something more. A presence, an unease, a shadow that never truly left. This was the shadow of the Witch of Port Arthur. Port Arthur, located on the Tasman Peninsula, was established in the year 1830 as a penal settlement. It was meant for the hardest of British convicts, repeat offenders, escapees, and men too broken or too dangerous for ordinary prisons. Over time, it became a self-sufficient community with a timber mill, workshops, a church, and even a boys' prison at Point Puer. But at its heart, Port Arthur was built on isolation and punishment. Convicts lived under a system of silent suffering. They were flogged, locked in solitary confinement, and worked from dawn to dusk. The separate prison, one of the most notorious structures, used psychological torment rather than physical chains. Prisoners wore hoods, were forbidden from speaking, and were often kept in total darkness. It was within this silence, some believed, that something was summoned. Locals from nearby settlements began to whisper about strange occurrences even before the prison closed in the year 1877. There were reports of voices in the wind, figures seen standing in the ruined windows, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Among the stories passed down through generations, one name surfaced again and again: the witch. But who was she? Some say she was never a real person, just a myth born of fear and fog. Others swear she was flesh and blood, a healer or midwife who lived outside the settlement, a woman who was wrongly accused by the superstitious men of the time. Still others claim she was something much older, a spirit that predated even the prison, awakened by the suffering and pain that soaked into the soil. There is a common thread in all these stories: a woman in black, always watching. Sometimes she is seen walking the shoreline at night, her feet not quite touching the ground. Sometimes she stands at the window of the separate prison, though the building has long since been abandoned. Her face is always pale, her eyes hollow, and her presence brings with it an overwhelming sense of grief. In the early years of the settlement, chaplains and guards recorded unexplained events in their journals. One entry from the year 1843 reads, "The men speak of a shadow in the chapel. It appears before floggings. They call her the Dark Widow. I do not believe in witches, but something is wrong here." That entry came just days before a young officer threw himself into the harbor, claiming he was being followed by a weeping woman. His body was never recovered. Another tale tells of a group of convicts who refused to enter the chapel for Sunday Mass. They claim to have seen a woman kneeling at the altar, her back turned, humming a song none of them recognized. When the guards investigated, the chapel was empty, except for a strange, burnt smell that lingered for days.
The haunting did not stop when the prison closed. When Port Arthur became a tourist site, guides began to report equipment failures, sudden drops in temperature, and shadows that appeared in photographs. Visitors have collapsed from panic. Children have spoken of the sad lady they saw in the garden. In one well-documented case from the year 1999, a group of visitors on a ghost tour watched in stunned silence as a misty figure appeared at the doors of the old separate prison. Several captured it on camera. Experts dismissed it as fog. Those who were there swear it was a woman. There are even reports from the staff. A former groundskeeper who worked at Port Arthur for over 20 years once gave an interview to a local radio station. In a trembling voice, he described hearing footsteps behind him at night when he was alone. "Always soft," he said, "like someone barefoot, and I swear more than once I heard a woman's voice saying my name." He quit the job soon after. The legend of the witch has become part of Tasmania's folklore. She's appeared in books, on television, and in whispers at campfires. But behind the legend lies something harder to ignore. A consistent trail of reports, diary entries, and personal testimonies spanning nearly 2 centuries. Some historians believe the legend was amplified by the isolation of the penal system, where loneliness and fear distorted the minds of the men trapped within. Others point to Tasmania's deep colonial wounds, the genocide of the Aboriginal people, the brutal treatment of convicts, the land's ancient power, as a kind of spiritual pressure that birthed something dark. Still, many locals don't need academic explanations. They know what they've seen, what they've felt. Tonight, we begin a journey through the true accounts. Each section will peel back the layers of time, drawing us deeper into the mystery. You'll meet the people, real people, whose lives crossed paths with something they couldn't explain. Some survived, some vanished. All were changed.
So, stay close now. The wind is rising and the shadows are stirring. Next, we'll meet the woman some believe started it all. The woman in black. The woman in black. Long before Port Arthur became a tourist destination, before the ghost tours and souvenir stands, before even the prison's iron gates had rusted in silence, the legend of the witch had a name. Or, rather, she had many. But in hushed tones across the Tasman Peninsula, she was most often called simply the woman in black. Her true identity, like much of Tasmania's colonial past, is wrapped in layers of uncertainty, stitched together from fragments of records, oral histories, and colonial whispers. Yet one name keeps surfacing: Mary Donlan. Mary arrived in Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania was then known, in the early 1840s. She did not come as a convict, but rather as a free settler aboard a merchant vessel from Dublin. Widowed young, Mary traveled alone, something almost unheard of for a woman at that time. Some claimed she had no husband at all, and that the title of widow was a convenient shield in a world suspicious of unmarried women. She settled in a cottage just outside the boundaries of the Port Arthur settlement, near what is now known as the Carnarvon Bay Track. A strange place to live alone, surrounded by dense bushland and the occasional cry of a devil in the night. But Mary, by all accounts, was unbothered. What she did for a living remains unclear. Some said she worked as a herbalist, gathering native plants to create salves and teas. Others believed she was a midwife, often called into the homes of nearby settlers when labor turned difficult. There are a handful of official references to a Mrs. D assisting with childbirths in the region between the years 1844 and 1851. But beyond that, the records grow thin, and the rumors grow thick. Children were warned not to go near her property. The Black Widow, they called her. Women accused her of sorcery when miscarriages occurred or illness lingered. Men, especially the guards of Port Arthur, mocked her in public and avoided her in private. One officer's letter from the year 1848 described her as a gaunt figure cloaked in shadows, eyes like coal, and a voice like wind through trees. Still, no formal charges were ever brought against her. This was not Salem, and the British colony had no official laws against witchcraft by the mid-19th century. But superstition is a law unto itself. The first major incident involving Mary occurred in the winter of 1852. A young constable named Edward Blake had been sent to deliver a summons to her cottage. The details of the summons are lost, possibly regarding property boundaries or taxes. But what is known is that Blake never returned. Search parties combed the area for 2 days before he was found, miles from Mary's land, stumbling through the bush, incoherent and frostbitten. He could not explain what had happened. All he said, again and again, was, "She's not alone out there. She's not alone." Blake was discharged from service shortly after, citing mental instability. He died in Hobart 4 years later, never having fully recovered his senses.
Following the incident, Mary's isolation became complete. Local farmers refused to speak with her. Supply deliveries stopped. And yet, her garden flourished. Her chimney always smoked in winter. Some say she was seen walking by the shoreline at dusk, muttering to herself. A few claimed they saw strange lights on her land at night, flickering blue, like swamp gas, but hovering in the trees. One settler, a timber worker named Joseph Warren, claimed to have stolen into her garden late one evening in hopes of catching her in the act of sorcery. What he found was not witchcraft, he said, but sadness. Mary was kneeling in the dirt, hands clasped, rocking slowly. She was weeping. He told no one until years later, on his deathbed. In 1857, a fire swept through the peninsula. Several properties were destroyed, including the small Methodist chapel outside Port Arthur. But Mary's cottage remained untouched. Not a single wall was blackened. When questioned, she is said to have replied, "The fire does not take what it already owns." The statement was dismissed as madness. The following year, a string of infant deaths rocked the settlement. 3 newborns died within a month, all delivered by Mary. Grieving parents accused her of negligence, or worse. They claimed she had cursed the babies, or that her hands were the cause of death, not poor health. An inquiry was held, but no evidence could be found. Her knowledge of herbal medicine was extensive but not illegal. Still, the suspicion remained. Mary vanished in the winter of 1859. One morning, a shepherd passing near her land found the garden overgrown, the chimney cold, and the door ajar. Inside, the cottage was undisturbed, but empty. Her bed was made, her tea set was washed. A single sprig of eucalyptus lay on the table, tied with black thread. No body was ever found. Some believe she simply wandered into the bush and died. Others think she left Tasmania altogether, but those who lived near Port Arthur had a different story. They believed Mary Donlan never left, that she had joined the land, becoming something else, something tied to the sorrow of the place. They began calling her the Woman in Black, the same figure that convicts later claimed to see in their dreams, the one who stood silently at the edge of the separate prison, watching. To this day, visitors have reported seeing a lone figure in dark clothing walking the bush trail behind the commandant's house. The same route Mary once traveled to collect herbs. She vanishes before you reach her, always. No record exists of Mary's birth or death in official documents. She left behind no children, no heirs, no grave. But her presence persists. She is remembered not just in legend, but in the fear that still clings to the mist at Port Arthur, in the sudden cold that takes you when you walk past the ruins of the old cottage foundation, now hidden under ferns and silence. in the stories whispered by guides who will not walk certain paths after sunset, and in the hearts of those who believe that the greatest horror is not what was done at Port Arthur, but what was awakened. Next, we turn to one of the oldest and most haunting tales from the Convict era, the story of the man who dared to mock the woman in black and paid the price. The Convict's Curse.
The Convict's Curse. The convicts who lived and died within the stone confines of Port Arthur's penal settlement were hardened men, thieves, repeat offenders, and those society deemed irredeemable. But even the roughest among them learned to fear more than just the lash or the solitary cell. Among the clink of chains and the endless rhythm of forced labor, a darker dread whispered through the ranks, the story of a man named Thomas Calder and the terrible price he paid for mocking the woman in black. Thomas arrived in Van Diemen's Land in the year 1845, sentenced to 15 years transportation for burglary and arson. He was a big man with a foul temper and a habit of making enemies wherever he went. Before being transferred to Port Arthur, he had escaped twice from lesser penal stations, only to be dragged back each time with more years added to his sentence. In Port Arthur, escape was near impossible. The settlement was surrounded on 3 sides by ocean, and the 4th was watched by dogs and guards. The nearest exit was Eagle Hawk Neck, a narrow strip of land so heavily patrolled it was called the Dog Line. Here, Calder's reputation earned him the attention of both inmates and overseers. He was known for brawling, backtalk, and a complete absence of fear, until he crossed her. It began with the garden duty. Calder had been assigned to clear brush near the edge of the prison's boundary, in a wooded patch once used as farmland. The area backed onto a stretch of old growth, dense, quiet bushland that the men called the Widow's Grove. The name came from stories that filtered through the years, tales of a woman seen moving between the trees, her face always turned away. Calder, ever the braggart, laughed when he heard the name. A ghost? Bah, he spat. I'd give her a scare if she ever dared show her face. The other prisoners warned him to keep quiet. One man, a weathered old soul named James Pitcher, whispered, "She don't like men who laugh. Seen too many do it and go missing." Calder scoffed. "I've seen worse things than some bush witch with a dress full of leaves." That night, the guards reported Calder returned from duty later than usual, covered in dirt and scratches. He was pale, muttering under his breath, and refused to eat. When asked what had happened, he said nothing, just stared at the wall and twisted the hem of his shirt between his fingers like a child. At first, they thought he was sick. Port Arthur had seen outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery, and isolation was routine. But Calder showed no signs of fever, only fear. He began waking up screaming, shouting about a woman with black eyes who stood over his bed. He claimed she watched him, but never spoke. That she was always there, even when he shut his eyes. The prison doctor noted these episodes in his ledger, writing, "Calder's condition declines, persistent hallucinations, possible malingering, though symptoms genuine, no physical illness detected." By the end of the week, Calder had carved strange symbols into the wall of his cell, shapes no one recognized. When questioned, he said only, "She showed me." Then came the final morning. Calder was found dead in his bed, not from wounds, not from poison or sickness, just gone. His eyes wide open, mouth agape, frozen in a look of pure terror. The guards swore he had not been ill the night before. One even claimed to have spoken to him at lights out. The doctor wrote in his report, "No signs of trauma, cause of death unknown, muscles locked in rigor mortis far sooner than expected."
There was one other detail. Beneath Calder's bed, the guards found a bundle of black cloth, not part of any prison uniform. It was tied in a knot and soaked in cold sweat, as if someone had held it tight in a clenched fist until the moment of death. After Calder's burial in the Isle of the Dead, the nearby convict cemetery, a change fell over the men. The laughter stopped. The tales grew quieter. Even the boldest inmates refused to go near the widow's grove. James Pitcher, the old convict who had warned Calder, spoke to a chaplain shortly before his own release. He said, "She picks who she wants. You mock her, she follows. You speak her name, she listens. And when she's done with you, no one else will find you." Over the following decades, other convicts who dared mock the legend suffered similar fates: sudden deaths, disappearances, mental collapse. And each time, the same story was whispered: that the woman in black had been seen near their quarters, that they'd spoken of her with scorn and paid the price. Skeptics claimed these were nothing more than ghost stories passed among prisoners to breed fear and obedience. But not all the victims were convicts. In the year 1861, a young chaplain named Reverend Fletcher wrote of a strange experience while visiting the separate prison. He'd recently delivered a sermon denouncing superstition among the inmates, warning them that ghosts and witches were tools of ignorance. Days later, he fell from the steps of the chapel tower. Witnesses said he screamed before he fell, not in pain, but in terror. His final words, "She was behind me." The coroner declared it an accident, but the guards who carried his body swore they found a single long hair, black as pitch, clutched in the Reverend's hand. So the stories endured. To this day, guides and caretakers at Port Arthur will not speak of Calder by name on the grounds. Some refuse to step into the old garden where the brush once grew wild. Tourists have reported sudden chills, the sound of whispers, and a feeling of dread in that particular corner of the site. And among the stories of the witch, Calder's tale is often the first told. The warning at the gate, the curse that proved laughter can be fatal. It wasn't just about belief, it was about respect, about understanding that in a land soaked with suffering, some things survive. Next, we move into the very heart of Port Arthur's darkness, the stone walls where silence ruled, and the woman's presence was most often felt. Prison walls and whispered spells.
Prison walls and whispered spells. The separate prison at Port Arthur was unlike any other structure in the colony. Designed to break the spirit rather than the body, it was an experiment in psychological punishment, imported directly from the British penal philosophy of the mid-19th century. Here, prisoners were cloaked in silence, not metaphorically, but literally. No talking, no looking at one another, no sound beyond the shuffle of feet and the click of keys. Even their names were stripped away, replaced with numbers. It was meant to reform. It often destroyed. And yet, it was in this very silence that the legend of the woman in black grew louder than ever. Constructed in the early 1850s, the separate prison was made of sandstone, iron, and cold logic. Each man was kept in a single cell, barely large enough to lie down in. The walls were thick, the air always damp, and the only escape came in the form of books or prayer. Prisoners attended chapel in silence, ate alone, worked alone, and sometimes emerged from their sentence shadows of the men they had been. From the very beginning, strange things plagued the separate prison. Guards reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways, chains rattling with no cause, and the echo of soft weeping from within sealed cells. The wardens, hardened men who had seen every kind of cruelty, refused to enter certain wings alone. And more than once, prisoners were found rocking back and forth in corners, whispering about the woman in the wall. One of the most unsettling cases was that of William Searle, a young convict sentenced to Port Arthur for forgery. Unlike the violent offenders who made up the bulk of the prison population, Searle had been educated, a school teacher before the law caught up with him. He lasted less than 6 weeks in the separate prison before breaking down completely. In a journal entry from the prison chaplain dated the 22nd of October, 1856, the following passage appears. "Searle refuses to speak during our weekly session. Instead, He points to the far corner of his cell and says, "She's there, always watching. She never blinks." Guards who inspected the cell found nothing. No breach, no hole, no hidden door. But on the far wall, scratched faintly into the stone, were the words, "She stands behind the silence." Searle was later transferred to the asylum wing and died 2 months after, having starved himself to death. His final words, overheard by an attendant, were, "She told me I must choose, silence or fire." Another case came from a lifer named Patrick Dugan, who had been locked in solitary for attacking a guard. He reportedly scratched dozens of symbols into the floor with his fingernails, circular runes, unfamiliar letters, and a repeated triangle enclosing a crescent shape. When asked what they meant, he claimed they were a shield given to him by a bush witch to keep the Black Widow out of his dreams. Inmates in neighboring cells said they heard him chanting at night, not in English, but in a low, guttural language none of them recognized. A week later, he was found unconscious, bleeding from his ears. He survived but refused to speak again. These events, strange as they were, might have faded into obscurity if not for the reports from the guards.
One sergeant, Thomas Avery, wrote a series of letters to his wife between the years 1855 and 1859. Preserved by his descendants, they tell a chilling tale of his time overseeing the separate prison. In one letter, dated the 5th of June, 1858, he writes, "I have taken to carrying a small mirror in my breast pocket, not for vanity, but for fear. I swear I caught a glimpse of something standing behind me last night as I locked the eastern wing. A woman, or something shaped like one, tall, in black, with no face. When I turned, there was nothing, but the air smelled of smoke, like old wood burning." Avery eventually requested a transfer to the outer works and never set foot in the separate prison again. He lived out the rest of his days in Launceston and refused to speak of Port Arthur until the day he died. What lends these stories weight is the number of independent accounts that mirror one another across decades. From the 1850s through to the late 19th century, a pattern emerges: isolation, hallucinations, sightings of a female figure dressed in black, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Modern researchers have attempted to explain these occurrences. Some blame the design of the prison itself, the total silence, the lack of sunlight, the sensory deprivation, all of it capable of inducing hallucinations, paranoia, and psychotic breaks. And it's true, the separate prison was a psychological pressure cooker. But even so, it doesn't account for the consistency of the visions. The same woman, the same presence, across generations of inmates and staff. In more recent times, paranormal investigators have been granted limited access to the prison at night. In one such investigation in the early 2000s, thermal imaging equipment picked up a cold spot that moved independently through the hallways. Digital recorders captured what some interpreted as a low female hum, though no one present recalled hearing it at the time. More unsettling still, one guide reported finding a small pile of blackened eucalyptus leaves in one of the empty cells, though no such leaves grow near that part of the site. Visitors have also had their own encounters. A young backpacker from Melbourne wrote on a travel blog about her tour of the prison. She described feeling as though someone was brushing her hair as she stood in one of the cells. She turned, no one was there. The guide was meters away. When she looked in the mirror later that evening, 3 long strands of dark hair, not her own, were caught in the hood of her jacket. While the woman in black may never be confirmed by history books, her presence in the walls of the separate prison continues to be felt. She is not loud. She does not scream. She watches. She waits. And in the silence where names are forgotten, she becomes the only voice. Next, We venture outside the stone walls to a place far older than the prison itself, a gnarled old tree where justice was once delivered, and where the witch is said to have made her most public appearance. The hanging tree.
The hanging tree. On the edge of the Port Arthur settlement, beyond the orderly ruins and graveled paths of the historical site, stands a tree that seems older than time itself. It does not appear on the guided tours. Most visitors will never see it. The tree is twisted and blackened, its bark thick with the lichen of decades, if not centuries. Locals call it the hanging tree, a name passed down through generations of whispered warnings and uneasy glances. Officially, executions at Port Arthur were carried out inside the settlement itself. Gallows stood near the separate prison, and the dead were buried in the Isle of the Dead. But before the construction of the formal gallows in the mid-19th century, it is believed that some of the earliest executions, especially of escaped convicts or bushrangers captured in the surrounding wilderness, took place beneath this very tree. There is no plaque, no preserved rope, no record in the tour guidebook, but the stories persist. The hanging tree stands alone in a clearing just off a now overgrown path that once led to a timber line used by convicts for logging. The area was abandoned in the late 1840s, after a series of accidents and mysterious injuries led the overseers to deem it unsafe. But some say it was not accidents that drove the men away. They say it was her. The first reported sighting of the woman in black beneath the hanging tree dates back to the year 1847. A young overseer named Charles Radley claimed to have seen a woman standing at the base of the tree at dawn. She was barefoot, dressed in black, her head bowed. Assuming she was a settler in distress, he approached her. As he neared, she slowly looked up, and he saw that she had no eyes. He collapsed in a fit of terror and was found hours later by a search party, lying in the dirt, muttering nonsense. He never returned to Port Arthur. Radley's encounter was dismissed by the authorities, chalked up to exhaustion or the after effects of local moonshine. But within months, other sightings followed. Convicts sent to cut timber in the nearby grove began refusing to enter the area. One man, Thomas Briggs, claimed to have seen a woman hanging from the tree itself, her body swaying, though there was no wind. As he ran, he tripped and broke his leg. He swore he heard laughter echoing from the branches above him. The guards beat him for refusing to return to work. He refused again the next day, and the next. Eventually, he was reassigned to stone breaking, a safer job by comparison. In the year 1852, a particularly brutal overseer named Francis Yates took it upon himself to quell the hysteria surrounding the tree. Known for his cruelty, Yates had no time for ghost stories. He marched 5 convicts into the grove, ordering them to cut down the hanging tree and put an end to the superstition. What happened next became one of the most whispered about incidents in the history of the settlement. According to the convicts, the moment they placed the first axe against the bark, the wind picked up. The air, which had been still and hot moments before, turned cold and biting. Birds scattered. The sky darkened, though it was midday. Yates, undeterred, ordered the men to continue. One struck the tree. The axe bounced back and cut his own hand. Another lost his footing and sliced into his leg. A third simply fainted, collapsing in the underbrush. The rest ran. Yates stood his ground, or tried to. When the others returned with guards, they found him face down at the base of the tree, unconscious. When he awoke hours later, his hair had gone completely white. He never spoke again.
Yates was sent to Hobart, where he lived under the care of his sister until his death 5 years later. Medical notes from the time describe his condition as a complete mental fracture brought about by sudden trauma. He had no history of mental illness. After that, the hanging tree was left alone. Locals say that during certain nights, especially under a new moon, a strange mist gathers in the clearing. Animals avoid it. Tourists who wander off the main paths sometimes find themselves there, though they do not recall how. One woman, a writer from Sydney visiting in the early 2000s, claimed to have stumbled across the tree while hiking. She described it in her blog as a place where the air felt too thick to breathe, like walking into someone else's nightmare.
She later suffered from recurring night terrors in which a woman stood at the foot of her bed, her head cocked to one side, lips moving but no sound emerging. The dream stopped only after she burned the boots she had worn that day. Folklore around the hanging tree continues to evolve, but one consistent theme remains, that it is a place of punishment, not just of the body, but of the soul. Some believe the woman in black once stood beneath it in life, perhaps watching a loved one die. Others say she was the one hanged there, wrongly executed and bound forever to the land in rage and sorrow.
There is no official record of a woman being executed at Port Arthur, but absence of record is not proof of absence. Early colonial Tasmania was not kind to women who lived on the fringes of society, especially those who worked with herbs, who kept to themselves, who defied the men in charge. The image of the woman in black beneath the tree, head bowed or swaying gently in the breeze, has become iconic among those who research Tasmania's haunted past. It is said that if you approach the tree after dark, you must never look up. If you do, you might see her. And if she sees you, she may never leave.
Next, we head back toward the water's edge, where the sea meets the stone and fog rolls thick across the bay. Here, among shipwrecks and ruined jetties, those who watched the shore at night spoke of impossible things. Mist on the bay. Mist on the bay. At Port Arthur, the sea is never still. Even on calm days, the waters of Carnarvon Bay seem to shift with a secret rhythm, lapping gently at the edge of the settlement like a breath being held, or a warning whispered. The convicts, guards, and settlers who lived here all shared a quiet respect for the bay, not just because it formed a natural prison wall, but because of what they sometimes saw upon it when the mist crept in. The Tasman Peninsula is shaped by water. Port Arthur itself juts into Carnarvon Bay, with forested slopes on one side and the sea on the other. During the colony's heyday in the mid-19th century, boats were constantly arriving and departing, bringing supplies, soldiers, and new prisoners. Most of them came under gray skies and cold winds, and many men described feeling an overwhelming sadness descend as they caught their first glimpse of the prison through the fog. But some saw more than sadness. The earliest written account of a strange figure on the bay comes from the ship's log of the brig Ariadne in the year 1843. The vessel had been delivering cargo to the settlement when the crew spotted what they described as a lone woman upon the water, clothed in black, unmoving, and untouched by the waves. The sighting occurred just after sunset. The sea was calm, visibility low. They assumed it was a trick of the light or a reflection, but when the brig dropped anchor, the captain sent a longboat to investigate, fearing someone may have fallen overboard or become stranded. The crew rowed out to the location where she had been seen. Nothing. No boat. No body. Not even a ripple on the surface. The incident might have been forgotten if it hadn't been recorded again, and again, by local ferry operators and sailors over the decades to follow. In the 1850s, ferrymen transporting convicts from the Isle of the Dead back to the main settlement reported seeing the same figure drifting just beyond the edge of the fog. Always a woman, always in black, always still. "She's gliding," one man wrote in his journal, later discovered by researchers. Not swimming, not walking, just moving, slow and steady. Her dress doesn't touch the water. I saw no face, just dark beneath her hood. These sightings were almost always accompanied by sudden changes in weather, a wind from the south, fog rolling in from nowhere, and the distant sound of sobbing that echoed across the bay, though no one else was in sight. The woman in black, as the legend deepened, came to be associated with the water as much as with the prison. Some believed she was bound to the bay, that she could only appear when the fog was thickest and the veil between worlds thinnest. Others said she had drowned long ago, either murdered or driven to throw herself into the sea. Her spirit, then, had become the mist itself, and when it moved across the water, so did she.
One particularly eerie account comes from a prisoner named Elias Braith, who worked on the dock repairing boats. In a confession given to the prison chaplain in 1862, Braith claimed he had been visited in a dream by the woman in black 3 nights in a row. Each time, she stood on the surface of the water, beckoning him. On the 4th night, Braith attempted to escape by stealing a skiff. He was found the next morning, washed ashore, his boat capsized and shattered. He was babbling about the woman who called to him, her voice like wind through reeds. He died in the infirmary 2 days later, lungs filled with seawater. The weather had been clear and calm that night, but it wasn't only prisoners and sailors who reported such visions. In the winter of 1871, the wife of a magistrate visiting the site with her husband claimed to see a woman standing at the end of the jetty. The fog was thick, but she was certain the figure was real. The woman turned and walked out onto the water, her feet never sinking, her body slowly fading as she moved away. The magistrate dismissed the account, calling it nerves, but his wife never returned to Port Arthur again. The lore surrounding the woman in black and the bay deepened as time went on. By the early 20th century, stories of her became part of the local fishing community's oral tradition. Some believed she was a harbinger, a warning of death or disaster. Boats that passed her, it was said, often returned damaged or not at all. An old Tasmanian fisherman, interviewed in the 1970s, recalled a tale passed down by his grandfather. "You don't go out when the mist hugs the water like that. Not if you see her. That's not weather. That's her cloak. That's her hunting." In recent decades, tourists and staff alike have made similar claims. A park ranger working night patrol in the late 1990s reported seeing a woman far out in the water during a moonless night. He radioed for assistance, fearing someone had fallen from a boat or attempted suicide. Search teams combed the area. No one was missing. CCTV footage showed no one entering the water. And yet, when the tide receded the next morning, a line of barefoot footprints was found in the sand. They led inland and vanished. Another modern visitor, a photographer from Queensland, captured a long exposure shot of the bay during an unusually thick fog. In the photo, displayed years later in a local gallery, was a faint figure in the center of the frame, dark, cloaked, standing on water. The artist claimed it was an artifact caused by moisture on the lens. Others weren't so sure. There are countless other tales. People who hear their names whispered as they walk the jetty. Visitors who feel hands on their shoulders when no one is near. Phones that die when pointed at the bay. Cameras that refuse to focus. Time seems to warp around the mist. Some guests report feeling they've stood on the shoreline for moments, only to find an hour has passed. To some, the woman in black is merely an echo, a sorrowful imprint left by centuries of suffering, projected onto the canvas of the sea. To others, she is a guardian of the dead, a ferry woman not across water, but between worlds. Either way, the bay remains her domain. So if you find yourself on the edge of Carnarvon Bay one morning, with the fog curling around your ankles and the sound of the sea holding its breath, do not call out. Do not stare too long at the figure you think you see. And above all, do not follow her voice. Next, we travel inland to a place once filled with the laughter and footsteps of children. A place where innocence vanished and silence crept in. Children of the Quarry.
Children of the Quarry. There is a quiet sorrow that lingers in the stones of Port Arthur, not just in the prisons or the chapel, but in the places often overlooked. One such place is the old sandstone quarry near the edge of the settlement. Today, it is little more than a hollowed slope overtaken by bush and moss. But in the 19th century, it rang with the echoes of picks and shovels and the voices of children. The boys of Puer, a separate juvenile prison established just across the water, were often sent to the quarry as part of their daily labor. From the year 1834 until its closure in 1849, hundreds of boys between the ages of 9 and 16 were housed, punished, and reformed there. Their crimes were minor: theft, truancy, vagrancy, but the discipline they faced was as harsh as that dealt to men 3 times their age. The quarry was one of the most physically demanding assignments. The boys carved sandstone blocks that would later be used in the construction of the very buildings that confined them. Under supervision, they worked in silence, covered in dust, sunburnt and exhausted. But it was not the labor that bred the darkest rumors. It was what happened after. Whispers among the older boys told of a woman who watched from the tree line. She never came close, never spoke, but was always there, just beyond the quarry's edge, clothed in black, her face hidden beneath a veil. If you stared at her for too long, they warned, you would see your own death in her shadow. At first, such tales were dismissed as childish fancy, a way for frightened boys to cope with the brutal environment. But then came the disappearances. In the summer of 1839, a 12-year-old named Samuel Greaves failed to return from quarry duty. The overseers assumed he had run, a rare but not unheard of occurrence. Search parties scoured the area, but no trace was ever found. 2 weeks later, another boy, Thomas Kennerly, vanished while fetching water near the quarry creek. This time, witnesses came forward. A third boy, trembling and near tears, claimed he had seen a lady in black standing behind the rocks where Thomas had last been seen. She had reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then both had vanished. The child was punished for lying. More boys disappeared over the next decade, 7 in total, all connected to the quarry or its surrounding forest. In each case, no remains were found. The official reports cite drowning, escape, or natural misadventure. But among the boys of Puer, the story took root like weed in stone. They called her the Mourner. According to their version of the tale, the mourner was once the mother of a boy who had died in the quarry, crushed beneath a sandstone slab after a shift that had run too long in failing light. She had begged for his body. She had been denied. No death record for such a boy exists, but the children believed. And belief, in a place like Port Arthur, had power. The mourner was said to claim those who were near death already: the sickly, the injured, the ones no longer strong enough to swing a pick. She would whisper their names, cradle their spirits, and carry them into the forest where no pain could reach them. To some boys, she was a monster. To others, she was a mother. In 1846, a group of older boys attempted to confront the legend. They dared one of their own, a 15-year-old named Henry Mallory, to walk into the quarry at dusk and stand where the last boy had vanished. Mallory agreed, boasting he feared no ghost. He never returned.
Only one boy from the group was willing to speak to authorities. His statement was brief. She came from the fog. He didn't scream, just smiled. Then he walked into the trees, holding her hand. The overseers dismissed the event as a runaway, but they closed the quarry later that year, citing unstable rock formations and repeated accidents. Point Puer itself was shut down 3 years later, and the remaining boys were transferred to other institutions on the mainland. The forest eventually swallowed the quarry. Vines climbed the walls, saplings grew from between the stones, and time did what it always does. It covered everything, but not completely. In the mid-20th century, local children exploring the area reported hearing singing in the wind, soft, feminine, and sorrowful. Some claim to see a figure walking along the overgrown edge of the quarry, trailing a dark dress behind her. Dogs refused to enter the area. Birds would not nest in the trees closest to the site. In the 1980s, a school group on a guided tour reported a mass panic when several students became distressed near the quarry's edge. They described an overwhelming feeling of sadness and the sound of weeping from below. The teachers could not explain the event, but the group cut the visit short and returned to Hobart early. A decade later, a young boy visiting with his family wandered off and was found standing alone near the quarry floor. When his mother asked what he was doing, he said, "She was telling me a story about the lost boys." His family left Tasmania the next day. Some modern folklorists have speculated that the mourner and the woman in black are the same entity, a singular force tied to grief, longing, and the injustices of the past. Others believe the quarry holds a different energy, one born of youthful sorrow and the forgotten dead. Regardless of interpretation, the impact of these stories is undeniable. The children who vanished were real. Their names appear on transport lists and prison rolls, but their fates remain blank. In a system where records were kept with military precision, such absences feel like open wounds. And so the legend endures, in the rustling of leaves, in the half-remembered lullabies that drift through the trees, in the footprints occasionally found in soft soil, too small to belong to any adult. If you walk the edge of the quarry today, you might feel it, that pause in the air, that hush before a voice you cannot hear begins to speak. Next, we delve into the pages of a long-forgotten journal. A Reverend's diary, hidden for over a century, reveals his encounters with something far beyond the doctrines of his faith. The Reverend's diary.
The Reverend's diary. Faith was meant to be the shield against darkness at Port Arthur. For many of the settlers, soldiers, and prisoners alike, the chapel offered a rare breath of sanctuary, a place where sins might be cleansed and hope kindled beneath the towering beams of colonial piety. But not all who entered its doors found comfort. And for one man, Reverend Jonathan Dean, the faith he carried into the settlement would be tested in ways no scripture had prepared him for. Reverend Dean arrived at Port Arthur in the year 1851, newly ordained, eager, and full of conviction. He was a man of structure and ritual, schooled in the traditions of the Anglican Church, and raised on the belief that good would always triumph if only one walked closely with God. Assigned to minister not only to the free settlers but also to the convicts, he saw his posting to Van Diemen's Land as a test of moral duty, a chance to shepherd lost souls back into the light.
He kept a detailed diary throughout his time at Port Arthur. Like many clergymen of the era, he viewed journal writing as both a spiritual exercise and a professional record. Most of the entries reflect the routine of prison ministry: sermons delivered, baptisms performed, deaths recorded. But over the course of his tenure, the tone of his writings began to shift, gradually at first, then with a growing urgency. These diaries were thought lost for over a century, until they were discovered in a private Hobart estate sale in the 1990s, bundled with other antique books. The weathered leather volume, its spine cracked and pages yellowed, contained one of the most compelling and disturbing personal accounts tied to the legend of the woman in black.
The earliest unusual entry is dated the 14th of July, 1852. Attended to 3 inmates in the separate prison. All complained of dreams, a woman in mourning garments standing beside them as they slept. I reminded them that such visions were the product of guilt and solitude, but one, a man named Joseph L., claimed she spoke to him. She said the walls remember, he told me. What nonsense. As the months passed, the entries grew darker. August 3rd, a shadow in the chapel. No figures present at the time. yet a chill passed through the pews as if someone had opened a door. But all doors were shut. The guards felt it too. One crossed himself, though he is not Catholic. October 19th, during prayer I saw her, not a face, just the impression, as if she had been standing behind me a moment before. My voice failed. The convicts noticed. I left the pulpit early. It wasn't long before the Reverend began questioning his own senses. In a passage dated December 12th, he describes being woken in the night by the sound of sobbing, not loud, but persistent, like a child in mourning. He lit a lantern and searched his quarters, then the chapel next door. Nothing. No one. But the sobbing continued, just at the edge of hearing, like it was coming from the walls themselves.
By the following year, Dean's entries had shifted entirely from theological reflections to personal confessions of fear. He wrote of seeing fleeting movements at the edge of candlelight, of books falling from shelves, of the altar cloths being found disturbed after services, always marked with a fine black ash that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Most chilling, however, were his dreams. He recorded them in obsessive detail. Dreams of a woman standing at the water's edge, of funeral processions with no mourners, of walking through the cemetery only to find every headstone bore his own name. But one dream repeated more than any other. He stood in the chapel pulpit, preaching to a sea of faceless prisoners. The pews were full, but every figure was cloaked in black, unmoving. And at the back, the woman stood, veiled and silent, watching. He wrote, "I am beginning to question whether she is a spirit of the dead or something older. Not evil, not as men understand it, but grief made flesh. Perhaps she is the colony's shame, or its reckoning." Some entries hint that he attempted to research her origins. He references conversations with older convicts and settler women who spoke of a bushwoman, a healer, who vanished years prior. Though he never names her, the descriptions align with earlier accounts of Mary Donlan, the suspected origin of the woman in black legend. His final months at Port Arthur were plagued by illness and paranoia. He ceased attending services regularly, citing migraines and fainting spells. In one of his last coherent entries, dated the 21st of March, 1854, he wrote, "I looked into the mirror and did not see myself, only her, standing behind me, hands on my shoulders. I am no longer afraid of her, only of what she wants me to know." Shortly thereafter, he was transferred to Hobart for medical treatment. His health had deteriorated rapidly, though no physician could find the root cause. He died in the spring of 1855 at the age of 39, from what was recorded as nervous collapse. His diary was never officially published. The Anglican Church distanced itself from the supernatural elements, preferring to remember Reverend Dean as a devoted, if troubled, servant of God. But those who have read the journal in full speak of its haunted tone, the gradual unraveling of a man who truly believed he was witnessing something sacred and profane. Today, the chapel at Port Arthur still stands, though its roof was lost to fire in the late 19th century. Visitors often describe a strange quiet within the stone remains, deeper than silence. Some report hearing footsteps behind them on the grass where the pews once stood. A few even claim to feel a hand on their back during moments of reflection, like someone urging them forward or holding them in place. Those who know the history say the Reverend never left. And as for the woman in black, she still returns to the place where her presence broke the faith of a holy man. Next, we walk through the scorched remnants of sacred ground, a chapel consumed not just by fire, but by a darkness that refuses to fade. Ashes in the chapel.
Ashes in the chapel. In the heart of Port Arthur stands the skeletal remains of what was once a place of worship, the penitentiary chapel. Unlike many colonial churches built in the ornate Gothic tradition, this one was shaped by harsh necessity and the expectations of discipline. Its sandstone walls rose firm and symmetrical, its bell tower visible from across the settlement. But today, only fragments remain, charred, exposed to the elements, and rumored to hold the scent of something more than burnt timber.
Though known as the chapel, the building never fully lost its association with punishment. For while it was intended as a house of God, it stood within the very bones of the former flour mill, a structure once used for labor so intense that men collapsed grinding wheat by hand. When that venture failed, the mill was repurposed, its industrial heart reforged into sacred space. The walls remained the same, so did the suffering. On Sundays, convicts filed into rows beneath watchful eyes, their silence as mandatory as their shackles. Preachers thundered from the pulpit about salvation, repentance, and divine justice. But to many inmates, the air inside felt heavier than outside, the stone colder, the flickering oil lamps less comforting. For some, the chapel was not a refuge, but a trap.
And then, in the year 1884, long after the prison had closed, fire came. The blaze swept through the empty structure in the dead of night. No lightning had struck, no campfire had been lit nearby, and no one was present to witness its ignition. Yet by morning, the roof was gone, the wooden interior reduced to ash, and the church lay exposed to the sky. Investigators at the time could not determine the cause. Electrical storms, one report speculated. Stray embers, said another. But among the ruins, they found something far stranger than scorched stone. A circle. Burnt into the floor where the pulpit once stood was a blackened ring, as if the fire had concentrated in a perfect radius. The rest of the timber had burned irregularly, as fire does, but this circle was precise, deliberate, and at its center lay the remnants of charred eucalyptus leaves and what appeared to be fragments of fabric, black, brittle, and resistant to crumbling under pressure. The local constable ordered the area sealed. For a time, no one stepped foot inside, but the incident sparked a wave of renewed interest in the old chapel's darker associations. Oral histories began to resurface, stories from former guards who spoke of strange happenings during services. One mentioned a woman seen pacing the upper gallery after the prisoners had been seated below. Another recalled hearing a soft hymn, feminine and unrecognizable, drifting from the rafters during silent prayer. It was around this time that the legend of the woman in black found firm footing among those who studied Tasmania's paranormal lore. She was now said to have been present in the chapel long before the fire, seated in the rear pews, cloaked and unmoving. A witness, perhaps, or a judge.
One such account came from a man named Colin Marr, a stone mason who worked on partial restoration of the ruins in the mid-20th century. In a taped interview with a Hobart journalist, Marr described feeling watched every time he stepped within the remaining walls. He said tools would go missing, only to be found outside the chapel the next day. One morning, he discovered a child's handprint in the dust on a fallen beam, though no children had been near the site. More disturbing, he claimed he once arrived early, before sunrise, and saw someone standing at the former altar space, a woman, in black, motionless. He called out. She did not move. When he stepped closer, she was gone. Years later, Marr's granddaughter shared his journal with researchers. One passage read, "There's a wrongness in the air here, like the fire didn't burn the evil away, only woke it up." Even today, the chapel's ruins seem to carry a particular weight. Visitors frequently report sudden changes in temperature, especially near the pulpit. Cameras malfunction, phones die inexplicably. One guide described a pressure in the chest, as if the space itself was heavy with expectation. Theories have emerged over the years. Some believe the chapel was the site of an attempted ritual, not from colonial times, but in the decades following the prison's closure. In the 1960s, a group of amateur spiritualists reportedly broke into the site under cover of darkness, conducting what they described as a séance. One member later spoke anonymously, claiming that during the ritual, a black-clad figure appeared in the smoke of their candle and told them to leave the dead alone. All members of the group abandoned their spiritualist practices shortly thereafter. Others believe the site itself is a thin place, where the veil between worlds wears thin, and what is felt is not one ghost, but many. That the woman in black is drawn to such locations, feeding off the sorrow etched into the stones, returning again and again to places where belief and pain converge. Still others insist that she was responsible for the fire, that the chapel, once filled with false promises and men condemned by earthly systems, was never hers to forgive, that she marked it, claimed it, cleansed it in her own way. A handful of visitors each year leave offerings at the chapel's edge, a flower, a letter, a coin. Some say it brings peace, others say it keeps her at bay. But if you ask the night watchman, they'll tell you the truth. Sometimes just before dawn, the smoke returns. Not thick, just enough to see from the hill, rising straight up from the empty space where the pulpit once stood, as if something long lost is still burning. And in the quiet, if you listen very closely, you might hear it, the soft hush of a hymn that was never written. Next we step forward in time, into the age of tourism, and into the dreams of modern visitors who come to Port Arthur seeking history, but leave with memories they cannot explain. Dreams of the visitors.
Dreams of the visitors. Port Arthur today is a place of careful curation, a historic site preserved with reverence, its past packaged into tidy narratives for school groups, tourists, and history buffs. There are signs and brochures, gift shops, and guided tours. But beneath this surface of neat explanations and period costumes lies something much harder to contain: the dreams. Not everyone who visits Port Arthur leaves with a clear memory of the site's history. Some leave with nightmares. Others speak of dreams so vivid and disturbing they feel more like experiences than fantasies. A growing number of these visitors, many with no prior knowledge of the woman in black, report eerily similar encounters, suggesting something far older and deeper is stirring in the soil. The first notable cluster of such dreams emerged in the early 1990s, just after an expansion of the site's ghost tour program. An operator named Anne Phelan, who led evening walks through the ruins, began keeping a private notebook of guest comments. What started as quirky feedback, felt a chill, weird photo, odd dream last night, quickly turned into something more disturbing. Dozens of guests reported dreaming of a woman standing at the foot of their bed, cloaked in black, unmoving, face obscured. In some dreams, she said nothing. In others, she whispered in a language no one could understand. A few claimed to wake up unable to move, frozen with a pressure on their chest, as though someone was leaning over them. One tourist from Queensland, a middle-aged teacher with no interest in the supernatural, described a dream in which she was buried alive in a chapel. Dirt filled her mouth, her lungs, and standing above the grave was a woman in black, singing. That teacher suffered a panic attack upon waking and spent the remainder of her trip in Hobart, refusing to return to the peninsula. Anne Phelan began asking guests specific questions. What time did you go to bed? Where did you stay? Did you dream before or after the tour? Her notes revealed a pattern. Most of the dreams occurred within 24 hours of visiting either the separate prison or the chapel ruins. The majority took place between 3 and 4 in the morning, the so-called devil's hour. Psychologists consulted later by researchers suggested that such dreams could be explained by the power of suggestion. The ghost tours, the atmosphere, the haunting stories, They created the right conditions for the mind to invent fear. But not all dreams can be so easily dismissed. In 2006, a group of university students from Melbourne visited the site for a history project. They stayed overnight at nearby accommodations and kept dream journals as part of an experimental essay on place-based trauma. On the first night, 4 of the 6 students reported dreaming of a cloaked woman standing in a long hallway, or a tall figure behind glass. None of them had read or heard about the woman in black before the visit. One of them, a psychology major named Liz Chen, dreamed that she was back in the separate prison, but alone. The cells were open. The walls bled. She heard someone crying. When she turned, a black-cloaked woman stood in the corridor, her veil fluttering as if underwater. Liz awoke vomiting and refused to re-enter the site the next day. The dreams are not always nightmares. A few visitors speak of a strange calm, of seeing the woman seated in a pew, her head bowed as if in prayer. One elderly visitor, a World War II veteran, described a dream in which she took his hand and walked with him silently through the prison. He later wrote, "It felt like grief, not menace. She was lonely."
But for most, the dreams carry weight. Tourists from around the world have posted anonymously in online forums, often without context, describing the same figure: black veil, quiet presence, unbearable sadness. One American traveler wrote, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in that dream. I woke up crying. I hadn't cried in 20 years. There are stories of people waking to see her standing in their hotel room, of shadows moving across windows in the early hours, of voices calling their name from empty hallways." Hotel managers in the Port Arthur region have quietly admitted to increased reports of sleep disturbances from guests who visit the site. One manager at a boutique inn near Carnarvon Bay confessed that she keeps extra herbal teas and dream journals on hand, having learned over the years that something follows some people back from the ruins. In 2019, a documentary crew filming a segment on Tasmanian legends stayed 3 nights near the site. 2 members of the crew experienced what they described as lucid dreams featuring the woman in black. One dreamt she placed her hand on his chest and whispered, "This is not over." He awoke with a sharp pain in the same spot. Doctors found no physical cause. He left the production 2 days later. Modern researchers studying the site now consider the psychological impact of Port Arthur as significant as its historical one. Trauma, it seems, is not just stored in people, it lingers in places. The woman in black, then, may be less a ghost than a vessel for the pain of generations: convicts, settlers, the displaced, the dead. She appears in dreams not to terrify, but to remember, or to be remembered. There's a quiet theory shared among the staff of Port Arthur Historic Site. It's never printed in brochures, never discussed on tours. They say that if you dream of the woman in black once, it may be just the mind playing tricks. If you dream of her twice, she has noticed you. And if you see her face, you may never dream of anything else again. So when you visit, tread lightly, walk with respect, and if you sleep nearby, place something bright, a candle, a white stone, a flower, by your bedside, not as protection, as a sign that you are listening. Next, we dig into the earth and uncover symbols carved in stone, left by those who may have known her before the legend even had a name. The Witch's Mark.
The Witch's Mark. Among the many mysteries scattered across the crumbling ruins and overgrown trails of Port Arthur, few are as physically enduring, or as quietly unsettling, as the marks. Carvings in stone, scratches in wood, etchings found beneath stairwells, within cells, and on chapel pews. They are not initials or convict graffiti, not messages of love or rebellion. These are symbols, ancient, deliberate, and chillingly out of place. The phenomenon known as the Witch's Mark has drawn quiet interest from historians and folklorists alike. Though largely undocumented in official site materials, staff, archaeologists, and local elders have privately acknowledged the existence of strange markings that defy classification. Unlike traditional convict scratchings, tally marks, dates, ship names, these symbols resemble the runes and talismans of old-world superstition. Triangles inside circles, spirals with breaks at cardinal points, crosses with 4 dots at their base, and always the same recurring sigil, a figure, sometimes abstract, sometimes crude, of a woman cloaked in black. The first recorded discovery came in the year 1873, when renovations were underway in the old guard tower. Workmen removing floorboards uncovered a series of carvings in the supporting beam beneath the chapel-facing wall. Though worn by time, they were visible enough to cause concern. One worker refused to continue. Another, more curious, copied the shapes into his notebook, later shown to a visiting clergyman who identified the marks as apotropaic, protective signs used across Europe to ward off witches or malevolent spirits. This revelation was quietly buried. The church did not wish to associate itself with superstition, and colonial authorities feared it would tarnish the prison's legacy of order and rationality, but the marks continued to surface. In the early 1900s, a visiting antiquarian named Sylvia Morris toured the ruins with a personal interest in folk symbols. On a walk through the remains of the penitentiary, she noticed a pattern of carvings along the inner walls of what had once been solitary cells. They were faint, as if scratched with fingernails or dull metal. The same symbol appeared at least 5 times, a crescent enclosed by a triangle, overlaid with a vertical line, a mark she recognized from European grimoires as associated with protective wards against female spirits of mourning. Morris wrote a paper on her findings, but it was rejected by colonial journals. Too speculative, they said, too pagan. Her work remains archived in the University of Tasmania Library, largely forgotten, but the marks didn't stop appearing. In 1968, during a re-stabilization project in the chapel ruins, stonemasons discovered a small stone beneath the pulpit bearing an intricate engraving, a 5-pointed star, a pentacle, surrounded by Latin phrases and the outline of a hooded woman. The stone was removed, cleaned, and examined. Experts from Hobart debated its origin. Some believed it had been carved by a convict trained in masonry. Others insisted it predated the prison itself, possibly originating from early European settlers who brought folk practices with them from Ireland or Cornwall. The star was quietly returned to the ground beneath the pulpit.
Staff at the site, when asked off the record, will admit there are more such stones, some hidden, some too fragile to move. One, located within a wall cavity behind the separate prison's eastern wing, was only found after a partial collapse revealed its presence. Etched with what appears to be a female silhouette surrounded by crow feathers and the symbol for air, the stone bore a phrase in Old English: "She comes through silence." Visitors with a keen eye have spotted similar markings on trees near the hanging tree site. Crude but recognizable echoes of the same warding signs found across medieval Europe. No one has claimed responsibility for these modern additions. Some believe they are the work of local witches or neo-pagans attempting to reconnect with Tasmania's colonial mythos. Others suspect something more primal, that these marks are being made by people who have felt her presence and are trying, in their own way, to protect themselves. In 2012, a folklorist named Dr. Lena Godfrey spent a month cataloging the marks across Port Arthur. Her goal was to map the placement, identify patterns, and cross-reference with known convict histories. What she found disturbed her. According to Godfrey's notes, later published in a limited academic paper, the symbols form a loose perimeter around specific hotspots: the quarry, the separate prison, the chapel, and the shoreline near the jetty. Together, these locations form a rough diamond with the chapel at its heart. Within this diamond, the the majority of supernatural sightings, dreams, and unexplained events have been recorded. Godfrey wrote, "It is as though someone, or many someones, attempted to contain something. The symbols are not random. They are placed at thresholds, corners, and liminal zones, points of passage. Someone was trying to bind her." Whether she refers to the woman in black or a more general presence is unclear. But what is certain is that these marks were made by individuals who feared something and believed in it deeply enough to etch protection into the very bones of the prison. And still the symbols are found. A tourist in 2023 posted a photo online of a small stone near the garden ruins, bearing the crescent and triangle mark. He had no idea what it meant, only that his phone refused to work until he stepped away. The photo itself uploaded days later, distorted but recognizable. Others have seen chalk marks on old doors, quickly washed away by rain. In the visitors center, a member of staff confessed to once finding a folded piece of black cloth tucked into the mouth of a sandstone gargoyle replica, a warding cloth tied with eucalyptus twine. When she picked it up, she said it felt warm. Symbols, after all, are more than decoration. They are stories carved in silence, warnings etched in stone, evidence of fear and belief. The witch's mark may not prove her existence, but it proves that people over generations felt her, feared her, fought to keep her at bay. Next, we head to the shoreline again, not to the adult prison, but to the smaller, harsher world of Point Puer, the boys' prison, and the crows that watched from the rooftops. Crows of Point Puer.
Crows of Point Puer. Across the narrow stretch of water from the main settlement of Port Arthur lies the hauntingly beautiful peninsula of Point Puer. Windswept and wild, it is today a place of tranquil bushland and sea views. But in the mid-19th century, this rugged outcrop was home to one of the British Empire's earliest experiments in juvenile reform, the Point Puer Boys' Prison. Between the years 1834 and 1849, more than 3,000 boys, some as young as 9, were sent to Point Puer. Many had committed petty crimes back in England, theft of food, small-scale vandalism, or simply being homeless. Authorities believed that separating them from the hardened men of the main prison might give them a better chance at moral rehabilitation. But for the boys themselves, Point Puer was no refuge. It was a place of silence, control, and hard labor, with ghosts of its own. One figure, in particular, loomed large over the boys' whispered stories. Not a guard, not a preacher, but a woman none of them ever truly met. The same woman convicts across the bay spoke of in secret, the woman in black. Yet here she had another name. They called her the Crow Mother. The name came not only from her dark appearance, always described as wearing a long black cloak, but from the birds that always seemed to accompany her. Crows, ravens, blackbirds, flocks of them, perched on the roofs of the dormitories, the corners of the mess hall, and especially the rafters of the punishment wing. The boys believed that when the crows gathered, she wasn't far behind. It began, as most legends do, with a death. In 1838, a boy named Elias Marden, aged just 10, was found at the bottom of the cliff that borders the eastern edge of Point Puer. No one saw him fall. There were no witnesses. His body was recovered at low tide, his hands scraped, his eyes open wide. Though officially ruled an accident, a fellow inmate later claimed Elias had told him the night before, "She wants me to go to the rocks. She says I'll see my mum." The story was quickly dismissed, but more strange events followed. At night, boys reported hearing tapping on the dormitory windows. Not the wind, not a branch. Tapping, like fingernails or beaks. One boy, William Chivers, swore he saw a woman standing by the waterline during roll call. No one else saw her, but the boy refused to sleep indoors for a week afterward, curling up in the dirt beside the carpenter's shed. And always, When these sightings occurred, the crows came. Convict overseers and staff began to notice the pattern too. One guard wrote in a letter to his brother in England, "These blasted crows. They come in black clouds sometimes, just before the mist rolls in. The boys go quiet, like they know something we don't. And truthfully, I'm beginning to wonder if they do."
The crows became so numerous that efforts were made to drive them off. Boys were given slingshots and encouraged to kill the birds with extra rations as reward. But the efforts were in vain. For every one driven off, 3 more seemed to return. Some began to believe the crows were the eyes of the woman in black, her messengers, her watchers. One boy, Thomas Rowe, claimed to have seen her feeding the crows. In an account recorded by a sympathetic doctor assigned briefly to the island, Thomas recounted slipping out of bed one night, sick with fever and confusion. He wandered toward the cliffs, drawn by what he described as a song like crying. There he saw her, a woman in black, crouched low, scattering ash into the wind. Around her feet, a circle of crows, all silent, unmoving. When the woman turned to him, her face was not hollow or monstrous, but pale, with eyes that shimmered like the ocean. "She smiled," he said, "but it wasn't happy. It was sad, like she knew I wasn't meant to stay here long." Thomas died 2 days later of pneumonia. The Crow Mother legend grew, despite the authorities' best efforts. The boys began marking the doorways of their dormitories with makeshift talismans, carved bits of wood, feather bundles, small stones arranged in triangles. When questioned, they said it kept her away, or depending on who you asked, let her know who needed her protection. Some believed she took the boys who were already fading, sick, broken, or close to madness, and gave them peace. Others thought she fed on their fear. Either way, her presence became a constant companion in their stories, dreams, and drawings. Yes, drawings. In 1974, during an archaeological survey of the Puer site, a team uncovered a series of crude carvings on a sandstone wall fragment buried near the original punishment yard. The carvings included stick figure children, a tall woman with elongated arms, and, unmistakably, birds. Dozens of them, etched in a tight circle around her feet. Experts debated the age of the graffiti, but local guides were convinced. The boys had been trying to remember something, or to warn those who came after. And still, the crows come. Visitors to the Puer ruins today report strange avian behavior. Large black birds will sometimes gather along the stone walls, watching in eerie silence. One guide recounted an incident in which a group of schoolchildren visiting the site stopped dead in their tracks as a dozen crows perched overhead began to caw in unison. Then all went silent at once. Moments later, one child began to cry. When asked why, she said, "The lady's sad." What makes this particular legend so compelling is the sense that the woman in black, or Crow Mother, may have been different with the boys than with the adult convicts. Not kinder, necessarily, but more complex. She was not just an avenging spirit or a figure of terror. To some boys, she was the only consistent presence in a world that treated them as disposable. Perhaps she was the mother they lost, the protector they were denied, or perhaps she was simply drawn to suffering, and Puer, with its broken innocence and silent grief, called to her in ways the main settlement never could. Next, we listen for the voice that echoes from the treetops and the shoreline, in the midnight wails and unexplainable cries heard across the settlement for centuries. A cry in the night.
A cry in the night. If there is one sound that unites all who have spent a night near the ruins of Port Arthur, from the convict to the colonel, from the tour guide to the unsuspecting camper, it is the cry, not of an animal, not of the wind, but of something human, something broken, a sound so drenched in sorrow that it bypasses the ears and goes straight to the bones. They call it the cry in the night. Long before the legend of the woman in black was committed to journals and tourist lore, there were reports of an unexplained wailing heard across the settlement. Often after midnight, often near the shoreline or drifting from within the cells of the old separate prison, the sound came unbidden, not loud, not theatrical, but low and persistent. Grieving, desperate. The earliest account comes from an overseer's report dated the 12th of August, 1837. Between the hours of 1 and 2 in the morning, several men stationed at the guard tower reported hearing what they described as a woman's lamentation echoing from the direction of the quarry path. A thorough search of the grounds yielded no individuals and no reason for the disturbance. Fog thick, unusually still. Such entries would recur over the decades, too many to dismiss, too scattered to consolidate into a single incident. They came from convicts, officers, visitors, and clergy. And always, the cry was described in similar terms. Long, drawn out, with no distinct language, just sound, pain, echoes of something lost. In 1850, a night patrolman named Henry Voss described the sound in a letter to his wife. It is not the cry of the whip, nor the fevered moan of the sick, but something else entirely. It begins soft, like a song hummed by someone weeping, then rises suddenly, like grief that's just remembered itself. I've heard it 3 nights in a row, always from the same direction, the back of the chapel. Voss eventually transferred to Hobart. He would later tell a reporter that Port Arthur was the only place where I feared the dead more than the living. Some tried to explain the phenomenon scientifically. Theories arose about wind tunnels, thermal currents, or nocturnal birds. One naturalist visiting the site in the 1870s wrote that certain geological features could produce whistling sounds that mimic human tones. But even he admitted the quality of the cry defied explanation. "It weeps," he wrote, "and no stone or breeze ever wept." Then came the night of the 23rd of May, 1869. That evening, a violent storm battered the Tasman Peninsula. Rain fell in sheets, and winds lashed the bay with fury. Amid the chaos, a group of convicts housed in the infirmary awoke to what they described as a woman's scream, louder and more urgent than anything they had heard before. Guards investigated, but no one was unaccounted for. No woman was present on the premises. Yet the cry was heard not only within the infirmary, but also by fishermen anchored offshore, one of whom later gave a statement to authorities. He said he saw a figure on the shoreline, just outside the lantern light, standing still, cloaked. He said the cry came from her, and that it wasn't fear, but sorrow. From that night on, the cry in the night became woven into the very identity of Port Arthur. The phenomenon continued after the prison closed, and into the modern era. In the 1920s, a local farmer camping near the ruins with his son reported waking to the sound of a woman sobbing outside their tent. He stepped out with a lantern. No one was there, but their tent ropes had been untied. In the 1950s, a constable patrolling the grounds after a rash of vandalism reported hearing the same sound near the ruins of the commandant's house. He followed the noise, calling out, thinking it was a local in distress. What he found instead was a row of eucalyptus leaves laid neatly across the chapel's front step, blackened at the edges, as if lightly singed. In more recent times, park rangers, maintenance crews, and ghost tour guides have all kept informal records of the cry. Most agree it peaks around the new moon. Some say it is strongest in winter. Others believe it is tied to particular dates, the anniversaries of deaths, executions, or disappearances. In 2011, an audio technician filming a historical documentary claimed to have recorded the cry unintentionally during a nighttime walkthrough. The footage, later aired on public television, featured a long, low wail at the edge of the frame. It did not match the voices of the crew. Sound analysts were brought in. The waveform did not correspond to wind, animals, or mechanical interference. The technician said only, "It didn't feel like a sound. It felt like someone was crying inside me." Some believe the cry belongs to the woman in black, that it is the echo of her final breath, or the echo of every final breath she ever witnessed, that she walks the grounds at night not to scare, but to mourn, that she is grief itself, untethered from body or time, a wound that reopens nightly. Others have offered more speculative theories, that the cry is a psychic residue, the collective agony of thousands of souls caught between punishment and death. That Port Arthur is a thin place, where suffering doesn't simply disappear, but accumulates, and sometimes spills back out. A smaller, stranger theory persists among those who have spent long nights alone near the site. They say the cry is not directed outward. It is not a scream for help or a warning. It is a call, a summons, that when you hear it, not with your ears, but in your ribs, you are being invited, not to follow, not even to understand, but simply to feel, and many who hear it weep. They don't know why, only that something ancient and wounded has found them. Next, we follow the trail of those who sought not to avoid her, but to speak to her, in the dark, in the ruins, with candles and salt and broken circles drawn into the earth. Ritual in the ruins. Ritual in the ruins. In a place as steeped in sorrow and spectral whispers as Port Arthur, there are those who do more than listen. There are those who seek. Not tourists or thrill seekers, not merely believers, but practitioners. Over the years, from the shadows of colonial days to the fringes of modern mysticism, people have gathered in the ruins to commune with something they do not fully understand. They come with candles and chalk, with chants and salt. They draw circles beneath the chapel's burnt beams. They kneel in the chapel pews at midnight, their breath fogging in the dark. And always, they say, they are trying to reach her, the woman in black. These are the rituals of the ruins, secret, scattered, and often forgotten. Yet their presence is undeniable, etched into the very stones of the settlement. The earliest recorded attempt at a ritualistic contact occurred in the late 19th century, after the prison had officially closed, but long before the ruins became a tourist attraction. A spiritualist from Hobart named Lydia Wainwright, inspired by the works of Allan Kardec and the burgeoning movement of table rapping and seances, visited Port Arthur in the winter of 1889. She brought with her 3 followers, all women, all well-read in esoteric lore, and conducted what she described in her private letters as a reclamation ceremony. The intention, she wrote, was to help the grieving spirit find peace. Wainwright believed the woman in black to be the lingering soul of a healer unjustly condemned, most likely Mary Donlin, the woman once thought to have lived near the settlement's boundary. The ritual was performed in the chapel, using mirrors, candles, and a spoken incantation that invoked both Christian and pre-Christian elements. Nothing occurred that night, but a week later, one of Wainwright's companions, a woman named Emmeline Brooke, vanished while on a solitary walk along the shoreline. Her parasol was found in the sand. Her footprints ended abruptly near the water's edge. Wainwright never performed another ritual. Her journals describe waking nightly to the sound of weeping, even after returning to Hobart. She burned her ceremonial tools and withdrew from spiritual circles. Before her death in 1906, she reportedly told a friend, she didn't want to be helped, she wanted to be heard. The 20th century brought new waves of seekers. In the 1950s, a group of students from the University of Tasmania's Anthropology Club attempted a midnight seance in the separate prison. Using a planchette made from convict-era wood and an old map of the site as a spirit board, they called upon the energies of the prison to make themselves known. According to the sole surviving member of the group, now in her 90s, the planchette moved on its own. The message it spelled was simple. She waits. When asked who she was, the board responded, mourning. The session ended when one student fainted, reportedly after seeing a woman standing in the reflection of a broken window. Years later, the same woman would tell a local newspaper, "There was no evil, no threat, only sadness, a depth of it I'd never felt. I think we called her to the surface, and I don't think she wanted to come."
In the 1970s, the rituals took a darker turn. During the countercultural movement, Port Arthur attracted occultists, pagan revivalists, and those drawn to places of death. One such figure was a man known only by his pseudonym, Morrigan. A self-declared witch and devotee of Celtic death goddesses, Morrigan conducted multiple unsanctioned rituals in the ruins, some of which were recorded in underground zines and esoteric pamphlets. He claimed to have successfully made contact with the woman in black on 3 occasions. In his writing, he refers to her as the Veiled One, describing her as neither spirit nor goddess, but something older, a personification of collective human grief. In a rare radio interview in 1978, Morrigan said, "She doesn't come when you call. She comes when you're ready to feel everything you've ever buried, and most people aren't." Soon after, Morrigan disappeared from the public eye. His small home in Battery Point was found empty. On his table, investigators found a bundle of crow feathers, a triangle carved into wood, and a single sentence scrawled on parchment. She opened her eyes. To this day, modern visitors leave behind evidence of quiet rituals. Black candles have been found burned down to waxy pools beneath the trees near the quarry. Feather bundles tied with string have been discovered in the rafters of the chapel. Circles of salt appear overnight on the stone floor of the separate prison, even though security footage shows no intruders. Guides sometimes find offerings left at the base of the hanging tree, folded notes, strands of hair, dried flowers, or, in one case, a child's toy wrapped in cloth. One guide, who has worked at the site for over 15 years, said softly when asked, "I think some people want to summon her, but I think others are just asking her not to come. There are those who say the rituals are dangerous, not because of what they awaken, but because of what they invite. That to call out to the woman in black is to ask for something you may not understand. That she doesn't give answers. She gives mirrors." One paranormal investigator who spent a week at the site in 2019 said his team conducted a controlled ritual using electromagnetic field triggers and temperature sensors in the chapel ruins. They left the area for 30 minutes. When they returned, their equipment was dead. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees. On one of their voice recorders, a sound could be heard. Not words, not footsteps, but breathing. Soft, slow, and unmistakably human. They ended the investigation early. Some say the woman in black does not need ritual to arrive, that she is always present, walking the border between this world and the next, that the candles, the chants, the symbols are not beacons, but apologies, that the rituals aren't about reaching her, they're about surviving her. Next, we follow her into the present, out of the ruins and into the living world, where her legend is not fading, but rising. The curse lives on.
The curse lives on. In most ghost stories, there's an ending, a final chapter that lets the dead rest, the haunted move on, and the legend become a harmless tale told around the fire. But Port Arthur does not offer that comfort. The woman in black is not fading. If anything, her presence is growing stronger, her story threading itself through the modern world like a creeping vine returning to familiar stone. Today, Port Arthur is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a place of learning, remembrance, and tourism. Hundreds of thousands of visitors walk its grounds each year, guided by plaques, signs, and stories of the penal past. But away from the tours, In hushed conversations, staff and locals still speak of the woman in black, not as a myth, but as a current. There's a phrase they use when speaking quietly about her: "The curse is in the stone." It refers not to evil in the theatrical sense, but to something deeper, a memory that the land itself refuses to forget. An impression left by grief so concentrated it has taken shape. And while that grief may not strike everyone who visits, those who do feel it in a way that alters them. In the last 2 decades, there has been a marked rise in reported experiences tied to the woman in black. Not just among ghost tour participants, but among archaeologists, conservationists, and even government workers. Some of these experiences are familiar: shadows seen from the corner of the eye, sudden drops in temperature, the overwhelming smell of smoke or eucalyptus. Others are more personal: dreams, visions, and even direct communication. In 2004, a local stonemason working on stabilization repairs at the separate prison collapsed mid-task. When revived, he claimed he had seen a woman walking slowly through the inner yard, head bowed, hands folded. She looked up and spoke his name. He had never spoken it aloud that day. He left the project immediately. In 2016, a digital media intern filming promotional footage captured a brief flicker of movement on the roof of the chapel ruins. When slowed down, the footage revealed a figure cloaked in black, her face obscured. The site director dismissed it as a glitch, but the intern deleted the video from her phone within a week. "I couldn't stand seeing her eyes," she later said. "And the strange part is, you never see her eyes in the video." But perhaps most unsettling is the way the woman's story has bled into the lives of those who never even visit Port Arthur. People who read about her, who watch videos, or listen to podcasts about the settlement's haunted past, sometimes report dreams, echoes, moments of stillness where they feel watched, not with malice, but with expectation. One woman, a travel blogger who had planned to visit the site but canceled last minute, wrote anonymously to a local paper, "I never stepped foot there, but after I wrote about her, she was in my house. She stood at the end of the hallway for 3 nights. I deleted everything. I won't say her name again." Some believe the curse is not in the land, but in the telling. That to learn about her, to truly engage with her story, is to invite her in. Not like a demon, not in some Hollywood way, but as a memory passed from mind to mind. A grief virus. A sorrow that seeks hosts. That is why many of the longtime guides at Port Arthur refuse to say her name. They refer to her only obliquely. She. The lady. That one. One former staff member who left after 5 years said, "It's not fear, it's respect. You don't call a storm by name when it's overhead." Even the local community feels her weight. Residents of the Tasman Peninsula report strange occurrences that coincide with anniversaries of deaths or events at the prison. Dogs whining at unseen forces, mirrors cracking during storms, children speaking of the sad lady in the trees. More than once, local authorities have responded to calls of a woman walking barefoot near the edge of the forest, only to find nothing, and no tracks left behind. And yet, despite this, people continue to come.
They come for the history, for the atmosphere, and yes, for the ghosts. The woman in black has become a figure of cultural fascination. She appears in documentaries, novels, even artworks sold in the visitors' center. But the irony is not lost on those who know her best. She is more present now, with more eyes upon her than ever before. The curse lives on, not because she wants to harm, but because she cannot leave. She is the embodiment of every story denied a resolution, every child buried without a name, every injustice buried beneath stone and silence. Her presence is not vengeance, it is persistence. She does not chase, she does not scream, she does not fade. She watches, and in the watching, she endures.
So if you ever walk those grounds, or hear the cry at night, or dream of a figure in black standing behind you in a reflection, know this: you are not cursed. You are part of the memory now, and memory never dies. Next, we close our journey with a farewell and a quiet thank you for stepping with us into the shadowed past of Tasmania's darkest legend. And now, dear listener, the mists settle once more over Carnarvon Bay, and the ruins of Port Arthur exhale the secrets they've shared tonight. We've walked together through stone corridors and burnt chapels, past whispers in the forest and shadows that refuse to fade. You've met the woman in black, not just as a ghost, but as a presence etched into memory, silence, and grief. Whether you believe in spirits or not, some stories cling to the land in ways that demand to be felt. This is one of them. And if she has lingered in your thoughts, if a part of you still hears her footsteps in the dark, you're not alone. Thank you for joining us on this journey into Tasmania's most haunting legend. If her story moved you, unsettled you, or stayed with you just a little longer than expected, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories like this to light, stories that remember what the world forgets. Until next time, sleep well, walk gently. And if you hear the cry in the night, don't be afraid. You were only meant to listen.